Opposing Globalization in the WTO by Aaron Abulafia, Melissa Eastman, and Casey Nick Williams.
GATT, beginning from its creation in 1948 and lasting till 1994, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade provided the rules for much of world trade and presided over periods that saw some of the highest growth rates in international commerce. The original intention was to create a third-party entity separate from any single country that would handle the trade side of international economic cooperation. In the early years, the GATT trade discussions concentrated on reducing tariffs. Then, further discussions known as the Kennedy Rounds in the mid-60s brought about a GATT anti-dumping agreement and a section on development. GATT's success in reducing tariffs to low levels, combined with a series of economic recessions in the early 1970s and early 1980s, drove governments to devise other forms of protection for sectors facing increased foreign competition. High rates of unemployment and constant factory closures led governments in Western Europe and North America to seek bilateral market-sharing arrangements with competitors and to embark on a subsidies race to maintain their hold on agricultural trade. Both these changes undermined GATT's credibility and effectiveness. In the early 1980s, world trade had become far more complex and important than 40 years before. The globalization of the world economy was underway. Trade in services not covered by the current GATT rules was of major interest to a growing number of countries, and international investment had expanded. Moreover, GATT's institutional structure and its dispute settlement system were of apparent cause for concern. Under the guise of these factors, GATT members began a new effort to expand the power of this third-party institution that would be better equipped to set rules and punish those who disobeyed them, which would eventually lead to the creation of the World Trade Organization.
NAFTA. Meanwhile, in North America, some parties were going about globalization in a different method. The North American Free Trade Agreement was created with the goal to eliminate barriers to trade and investment between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. The implementation of NAFTA on January 1, 1994, brought the immediate elimination of tariffs on more than one-half of Mexico's exports to the U.S. and more than one-third of U.S. exports to Mexico. Within 10 years of the implementation of the agreement, all U.S.-Mexico tariffs would be eliminated except for some U.S. agricultural exports. NAFTA also sought to eliminate non-tariff trade barriers and to protect the intellectual property rights of the products. It includes a process in which the public may raise their concerns about labor laws with any of NAFTA's member nations.
WTO. GATT and NAFTA were respectively a far cry from what the WTO is and what powers it has over global trade. The WTO was created on the objectives of helping trade flow smoothly, freely, fairly, and predictably on a global scale. It is an organization created mainly for the benefit of large corporations and their dealings on the world scale, and thus such corporations have a large degree of control within the system itself. If a government does not comply with a ruling from the WTO, the defendant is subject to a system known as retaliation and compensation. If a government or entity does not correct the violation it has been accused of and ruled against, and the plaintiff responds by seeking authorization from the WTO, the defending entity would have to make concessions to the opposition, known as compensations, or the defendant entity would be subject to some various forms of economic punishment, known as retaliation. Many of these disputes that are filed against national policies reflect human rights, environmental, or ethical positions, such as the case with Canada's WTO protest against France's ban on products containing asbestos, and many others mentioned throughout this presentation.
Disadvantages of free trade. Globalization was founded on the idea that individual countries would focus on developing their own specialties, trading for what they lacked in other areas. Although the idea in theory is picturesque, in practice, very few benefit as predicted. Several key points reflect this idea. First, as countries become more reliant on the global market, they experience increased domestic instability. This means that businesses, employees, and consumers are more vulnerable to downturns in the economies of their trading partners. This is increasingly evident in the past few years as the United States recession had led to decreased demand in Australian exports, leading to falling exports incomes, lower GDP, lower incomes, lower domestic demand, and rising unemployment. Free trade also makes it very difficult for developing countries to become established in such a competitive environment. With no short-term protection policies by governments, it is difficult to develop economies of scale in the face of competition from large foreign transnational corporations. Several other issues become much more apparent in the face of the World Trade Organization and their inability to facilitate trade and commerce in a fair and ethical manner.
Reasons to oppose the WTO. Since the creation of the WTO in 1995, much criticism has arisen about the unrestrained, misused power of the organization. One of the most widely criticized issues is that they prioritize trade and commercial considerations over all other values. Environmentalists especially find fault in this issue. For instance, the United States Endangered Species Act prohibits the sale of shrimp caught from nets that are not designed to let endangered or threatened sea turtles escape. In early 1997, India, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Thailand filed suit with the WTO to challenge this law. In spite of the fact that as many as 55,000 turtles a year are killed in nets, the WTO ruled against the United States, stating that it was not their task to review generally the desirability or necessity of the environmental objectives of the United States policy on sea turtle conservation. If the WTO does not begin to see the environmental needs of the world as a high priority, they will continue to exponentially accelerate the rate at which we continue to overstretch our resources. Through the WTO, poor and/or developing countries may be the most adversely affected for several reasons. First, third world countries are forced to enter the market against rich country multinationals, diminishing any opportunity to foster their budding domestic industries. Many times, larger companies are subject to surplus of resources, which allows them to lower their labor standards, therefore reducing their costs significantly. Smaller countries have little to no means to compete with this. Labor unionists believe that if the WTO were more stringent about labor laws, the playing field would have a better chance of leveling itself out. Under WTO law, a country can exploit child labor and still be a member, competing against other countries that have long since abolished it. This provides incentive for countries to take advantage of their cheaper resources, which decreases the labor conditions for all. Sticking with the WTO's overall style of killing the little man for the supposed greater good of the society, through the WTO's Agreement of Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, also known as TRIPS, member countries are obliged to adopt patents for the protection of new plant varieties, thereby legitimizing patents for living forms. The patenting of living organisms legally grants private monopoly control rights over them and their offspring. Developing countries, such as those in Africa, were impacted the most by the TRIPS agreement. Local and indigenous communities base their livelihood around the conservation of biological diversity. Rather than creating intellectual property rights that exert power through privatization, rights need to be implemented that recognize and protect the lives and livelihoods of local communities.
Canada salmon. In June of 1998, a WTO dispute settlement panel ruled in favor of Canada against Australia's quarantine against imports of uncooked wild salmon. Australia had imposed a limitation after a 1994 risk assessment found that such imports posed a threat to Australian wild salmon. Roughly 20 bacteria found in Canadian and U.S. salmon, but not in Australia, it concluded, posed a risk of spreading to the infected wild Australian salmon. The WTO ruling found that Australia's risk assessment was inadequate and not based on sound science. As a result, it said, the ban was more trade restrictive than required to achieve its appropriate level of sanitary protection and exceeded international standards. This ruling shifted the burden further onto importing countries that want to exclude a product to prove that the product is unsafe, rather than requiring exporting countries to prove that the products they send abroad are safe.
Gerber in Guatemala. In 1983, Guatemala passed legislation to encourage breastfeeding and limit the use and abuse of infant formula, which had been linked to high infant mortality rates in developing nations. Guatemala's legislature followed the World Health Organization in developing guidelines that would be useful for illiterate consumers. One restriction prohibited the use of images of bottle-feeding babies in advertising or marketing, and the law went into effect in 1988. All of Guatemalan domestic and foreign suppliers of infant formula made the necessary change to their packaging, and infant mortality rates dropped significantly. But one company, Gerber Food, refused to comply with the new regulations, using a picture of a pudgy baby in its packaging and marketing. The Guatemalan government for 5 years sought to compel Gerber to modify its labeling. In 1993, shortly before the Uruguay round of trade talks that would create the WTO, Gerber threatened the country with trade sanctions based on trademark infringement. By 1995, successfully intimidated the Guatemalan government backed down and exempted Gerber from its infant food labeling policy. Developing countries like Guatemala often lack the technical and financial means to defend themselves in international trade tribunals, and so can be successfully threatened by powerful corporate interests. Consequently, Guatemala was forced to sacrifice the well-being of its most vulnerable citizens to meet the demands of a multinational corporation.
United States and Caribbean banana farmers. The European Union has for many years provided preferential tariffs to former colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. These preferential tariffs favored some of the poorest countries in the world. The Caribbean island producers produce just 3% of the world's bananas and hold only 8% of the European Union market. These preferential tariffs favored these countries by providing them with a 7% guaranteed market access license at a lower tariff rate. The agreement was designed to benefit poor farmers in countries dependent on banana exports. In order to support their former colonies, the European Union created a two-tier tariff quota guaranteeing that the Caribbean bananas would be cheaper than their competitors. In 1996, the United States challenged the European Union, claiming the agreement was WTO illegal. While the WTO had previously granted the European Union a waiver for its policy, the WTO ruled with the U.S. The reasoning was that the special tariff quotas that the European Union provided to Caribbean banana producers had to be applied to all countries or eliminated.
Domestic protectionism. One of the solutions presented by critics of the WTO is domestic protectionism. Domestic protectionism is an economic policy of restricting or regulating trade with foreign nations through methods such as tariffs on importing goods, restrictive quotas, and a variety of government regulations designed to allow fair compensation between imports of goods and services produced domestically. The main strength of protectionism is that it keeps the domestic economy flowing. Since there is a decrease in imports, domestic firms have less competition and are able to thrive without the threat of collapse. For example, Brazil is able to produce steel at a much cheaper rate than the United States. If the United States is forced to continue to compete against Brazil, a domestic collapse is imminent, leading to hundreds of thousands of job losses. Protectionism would also give young, inexperienced firms more flexibility to function and develop at a decent rate because they are not pressured by powerful foreign firms. These infant firms can grow until they themselves are able to compete in international markets. Lastly, protectionism prevents dumping, leading to a decrease in prices for domestic consumers.
The future of world trade. While we do agree with these components of protectionism, we need a resolution that combines the two extremes of both protectionism and having a governing power such as the WTO. We do not feel that a governing body should be completely eliminated. However, the WTO would need to be seriously modified in order to facilitate world trade in a fair and reasonable manner. We're proposing that, rather than focusing solely on trade and commerce, a governing body be constructed that acknowledges its environmental responsibility and its ethical duty to mankind. If the WTO is chosen to remain as the reigning governing body, a country's environmental laws should take precedence over general commerce issues. Conversely, rather than overlooking country members' labor laws, we need to raise the standard. Not only will this directly benefit worker environments in many countries, but it will reduce dumping, allowing smaller countries to compete in international markets. Finally, smaller developing countries should be given equal weight as larger, richer countries. Every member of our proposed governing body should be formally represented at meetings and be provided with the necessary resources to represent themselves. To conclude, we reaffirm our discontent with the current state of the WTO and the negative impact that it's having on mankind as a whole.